Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Kristen Easterday, Director of Communications and Public Affairs at the Columbus Regional Airport Authority, and I'm also a member of the CMC Board of Trustees. I am so pleased you are all with us today. So let's take a moment to thank the Grange Insurance Audubon Center and its amazing staff for their ongoing support. And thank you as well to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream, which is carried on CMC's social media platforms. So let's thank all of today's supporting, All right, into the meat of today. According to a report from the federal EPA, Ohio's climate is changing and getting warmer. As we near Earth Day on April 22nd, today's forum will explore the current and future impacts of climate change on Ohio. Average annual temperatures in Ohio have increased by almost 3 degrees since the first Earth Day in 1970. In Columbus, that average increase is even higher, 3.7 degrees. The Ohio of 2095 may have weather that's more like Arkansas in the summer and Virginia in the winter. So to help us better understand the impact of climate change on our state and what we should be doing about it, I'd like to welcome today's speakers. We have Janae Graham, Senior Manager for Energy Advocacy with Impact Community Action. We have Luke Messinger, Executive Director of the Dawes Arboretum. We have Alana Shockey, who is Assistant Director of the City of Columbus Office of Sustainability, and Dr. Aaron Wilson, State Climatologist of Ohio and Assistant Professor, Ag Weather and Climate Field Specialist with The Ohio State University, and our host, Marshall McPeek, Chief Meteorologist for WSYX. And you can read more about today's speakers in your forum flyers. So Marshall, we look forward to today's conversation.
We could not have asked for a more beautiful day. Well, maybe it was a little better yesterday because there was a little more sunshine, but still, we'll take it. So thank you for having us today. This is going to be a great conversation, and we're going to dive into some science talk today. We're not going to get completely nerdy, but we will talk some science today. But more importantly, we're going to look at the human aspects of what's happening with climate change and how this is affecting actual people in our communities. So the science on this is actually pretty clear. We have the numbers, we have the data, thanks to the Byrd Polar Research Center at OSU. We have 10,000-year-old air samples that we can actually compare to what we have out there today. So the fact is that scientists can objectively right now show that our atmosphere is changing and that it's causing shifts in climate around the globe. So today, for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to make a few assumptions. And those are, climate change is real, climate change is happening, and climate change is already having an effect on our populations, so we need to address it. Those concepts are intrinsic to our conversation today. If you'd like to debate that, that's a conversation for a different day. The experts on our panel are actually seeing what's happening on the ground in real time, what's changing, and what it means for our society. So that said, right off the top, let's jump into why this ruffles so many feathers, which seems appropriate at Audubon, right? Senate Bill 83 is working its way through the Ohio legislature as we speak, and it is in a Senate committee. It is called the Ohio Higher Education Enhancement Act, and its intent is to influence the operation of colleges and universities that receive state funding. The bill would influence how certain topics are discussed in university classrooms, and it specifically mentions climate change as a topic of political controversy or as a controversial belief. So let's start with that with our panelists. Panel, tell me what you think. And Aaron, I'm going to start with you because you're in some of the university community there. Is climate change science or a belief?
Yeah, so absolutely science is the fact, right? It's the scientific evidence. Climate change is real, it's happening. I would go as far as to say those aren't assumptions of today's conversation. As a scientist, we have the evidence that proves that. When you start thinking about how we respond and what we do to these changes, sure, that's where we start talking about differences of paths and things that we can do. But there's a base knowledge that we have here, an overwhelming amount of data and evidence that shows these changes are happening, and they mean different things for different people depending on where you live. And that's, I think, another thing that's really, really important in this conversation.
Janae, how do we move that from belief to actionable item?
Yeah, I think the first thing that needs to happen is people actually have to acknowledge and realize that climate change is happening. And like was mentioned previously, it's disproportionately affecting various communities, especially in our area. Black and brown communities in particular will have the most drastic impacts with climate change occurring. And that's not something that we can debate on or really have the time to debate. And we have to make real change right now so that those effects are lessened.
Alana, you're seeing this happen in the city of Columbus. You have an entire department focused on it.
It's true, and luckily we also have all of you who have helped us, and really, we in December 2021 put together a Columbus Climate Action Plan that's a community climate action plan. So it relies on Janae and it relies on Aaron and all the other folks that are really contributing here, because we know that in many times it's our opportunity neighborhoods that are hotter, where they're experiencing greater incidences of flooding, and we know that we need to take action now to create a more resilient city. So it's not a debate here in Columbus. It's really about what are we doing collectively to create a movement.
Luke, what are you seeing at Dawes? Are the species beginning to react to what you see in the field?
Absolutely. One of the things we're starting to see is tree decline, and we can observe this. We've been seeing this through the 70s, where a lot of the hardwood forests that we're seeing are losing particular species, or they're in stressed situations due to the extreme weather conditions that they experience. But we're also seeing this in urban areas with dense populations, and we're losing the green space that we have in the urban areas that we have, not just the areas we're developing for new high technology, manufacturing and so forth, but also within cities that we're losing the green space, the very space that we need for our health.
So we're seeing these changes happen. So let's talk about how that's affecting actual people. So I want to start with Aaron again, because there's something that you encourage people to do, and it doesn't matter whether you're rural or urban, you're encouraging people to actually think about your climate change. So you're making it very personal. What does that mean?
Yeah, so weather is very personal, right? It depends on where you live, you're impacted differently, and that's really the scale that we are experiencing these changes, right? Weather is just the manifestation of moving energy around the globe, and as our climate change, then our weather patterns then reflect those changes. But if I'm living in California, right, it means something very different than somebody that's living in Iowa or Central Ohio or in New York. And even though we can have similar climate trends and actually have different climate trends, we can be impacted differently, even within the county, a single county. A farmer may not be impacted exactly the same as somebody who lives downtown or in the suburban areas or close to a river or things like that. So it's really complex. There's a lot of layers to it, right? And when we think about one of the main drivers or one of the main changes we're seeing here in Ohio are the extreme precipitation events, right? Think about Reynoldsburg last year. Think about Fort Lauderdale that just happened the last couple of days. Highly isolated events, right? You may not, you could have lived within 30 or 40 miles of Fort Lauderdale, maybe not even known it was going on. And so that's why I always talk about the personal nature of what's happening to our climate.
Do you find people are surprised when you ask them to do that? What surprises do they find when they say, this is my climate change?
Yeah, so it really starts with the challenge of thinking about, okay, if, how are things changing in your backyard? Tell me why or why not, right? And a lot of times, if people take a second to just slow down and think about, yeah, things were different back in the 70s or 80s, and of course, that's a short period of time, right? Climate change talks about much longer periods of time, and so getting into the differences between weather and climate, but that's what I think this helps us do, is to understand how they're related, how weather and climate are related, but also how they're different, right? And climate averages, let's think about this, December 23rd. What happened December 23rd, right? We went from 42 to -8 in about 12 hours, right? But guess what? We had our second warmest winter on record since 1895 this past year. That's the difference between weather and climate. Now, if I asked you on December 23rd, your answer might be different based on what you're experiencing. And so I think that's why it's important to really start there in the conversation.
So let's get into some of that personal experience then. So Janae, let's talk about impact community action. You're working with the city and you're working with individual neighborhoods to reduce the effects of climate change at a very local level, so where it's affecting real people on a regular basis. That involves a concept called climate justice. So explain what that means and how that relates to some of our local communities.
Perfect. So to me personally, climate justice means having the environmental know-how and knowledge to make an informed decision based on equity. I believe personally we have to have equity before we can have equality when it comes to these type of conversations, because it requires so much. Different neighborhoods, for example, have already disproportionately been impacted by industrialization, racism, systemic racism, redlining, these type of systems. So remedying those things must happen first before any kind of equality or any kind of plan can be made. And so what we're doing at Impact, the reason that my position even exists in the first place is because we noticed that there were a lot of folks coming to us for assistance for things like weatherization, like utility help, because they couldn't afford their utility bills, and they have such high energy burdens that they're spending upwards of 10%, for instance, on their energy bills just in 1 month. So imagine spending 10% of your income in 1 month just to pay your electric and gas. That's drastic for a person that doesn't already have the money and funding to take care of their families and their children. So that's kind of how Impact has gotten into that space. And what we're doing now is we have a lot of exciting projects to help kind of remedy some of those problems and issues that we kind of discussed a little bit further. One project that we have in particular is a Earmark for a solar grant, which will help with our workforce development programming, where folks from opportunity neighborhoods that are Columbus residents, that are young adults, get the opportunity to get green and construction trade experience, to go out into the field that historically has been underrepresented from people that look like me, like women, African Americans, young people, for instance. And this training allows them to get a job that pays a living wage to prepare and help their families to navigate this change that we're experiencing.
Is there anything that we can do as community members to help push climate justice forward?
Definitely. Oh man, that's a long list. How long do we have? First and foremost, just recognizing that your experience is not someone else's lived experience, that the things that we collectively do as a group affect others, and sometimes in a more exacerbated way. Like, for instance, urban heat island effect is a really real thing. You might go through, for instance, like Bexley. You can go up one street, up Parsons, for instance, and you'll have one area where you'll have like diesel, and you'll have bus fumes, and you'll have all these sort of other type of experiences, and then you'll go into a tree-lined area where it's, very nice and it's cool and it's breezy. But just realizing that just because your lived experience is different than someone else's doesn't mean that it doesn't affect the lives of someone else. So taking efforts in your daily life to curb climate change and enforcing climate justice and environmental justice efforts, I think are going to be crucial.
Alana, the city is working on a lot of these things already. There's an Office of Sustainability, so recognizing that this is happening and that's something that we need to do about. You've got an entire staff that's focused on climate change and conservation and resilience. But you mentioned a little bit ago the Climate Action Plan that is made specifically for the city of Columbus. Tell us a little bit about that and how that affects what the rest of us do on a daily basis.
That's a great question, and I just, want to second what Aaron and Janae said about trusting people and trusting their experience, because that is really what the Climate Action Plan is rooted in, right? It's rooted in equity and the idea that people know their climate experience, but they haven't yet maybe established the vocabulary to really be able to talk about it, right? And the more that we talk to one another about our experiences, the more comfortable we feel, where we don't feel like, well, I don't really know enough, and that's highly scientific, so I'm not sure that I feel comfortable talking to my neighbor or talking to, other folks in my community about my climate experience, right? And so that's something that the Climate Action Plan seeks to do, right? It seeks to raise awareness in our community that climate is a challenge, and as part of that challenge, work to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we've set a very bold goal that is aligned with science that says that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as a community by 45% by 2030. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as a community by 100%, right? We need to be carbon neutral by 2050. And that's a big challenge in the region that we live in, where we know that growth is coming. But it's also a great opportunity for us right now, when we know that the growth is coming, when we know that our population is going to increase, to think about how do we do things not just more sustainably, right? Because sustaining would really mean, keeping things the way they are. But more than that, right? How do we make it so that we're prospering as a region, and we're prospering for all of the people in our region?
So you're going to get pushback from that on this is going to affect the economy. This is going to cost taxpayer dollars. This is going to cost something. So how do you get past that into action?
Yeah, and that is also kind of what the Climate Action Plan seeks to do, right, is to take our bold goals and to move to implementation, right? And part of that is really thinking about our existing budget. And when you start to think about the existing budget that we as a city have, but then, because it's a community plan, what all of our community members have as their existing budgets, you often see that the types of things that you're budgeting for, buildings, transportation, waste, those are things that you're already including and budgeting for. It's just a recalibrating in where am I putting that money and how am I investing that money. So I'm thinking about, can I find alternative renewable energy? Can I tighten up my building envelope, as Janae said, to make me more comfortable in the building, but also to save on my utility bills, which ultimately is actually a savings of money. So it's a little bit of there's money there, we're already spending that money, let's spend it in wise and right ways that are gonna help us in our climate.
So electric vehicles are part of that equation. I want to share with you something that was on Fox 28 News at 10 last night. And this is an actual poll from our folks at Gallup. And they wanted to know, where do you stand on electric vehicles? And 4% said that they currently own an electric vehicle. 12% said that they're considering it. But then there was 43% that said they might consider it, and another 41 that said they would never, ever own an electric vehicle. What does something like that, knowing those numbers are there, what does that mean to your action plan?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that is really, our region has, I see Zach in the background, but, our region has worked on electric vehicle adoption, right, through our Smart Columbus work. And we're continuing to grow that work. And oftentimes what we see, particularly with regard to that issue, is the personal experience. If you can get someone in an electric vehicle, if you can get them to see what the electric vehicle experience really is, you'll find that those are zippy cars. They're fun to drive. But you'll also find that you're getting there's range anxiety is often a real issue for folks. But when they start to see you can get great range, you can get to and from where you need to get in town and not worry about charging. You'll find that there are hybrid options for folks. I own a Pacifica that's a plug-in Pacifica, and it is great, right? I can get from here to there all week on all electric, and it's really only on the weekends that I'm using my gas tank. But it's that personal experience again, right? It's the need to actually see, touch, experience the electric vehicle that we think changes the hearts and minds.
Luke, you're out in Licking County. We've heard there's a project that might be happening in that neck of the woods. So what do you see in terms of new developments coming into that area, and what effect does that have on a place like Dawes, where you are very environment conscious?
Right. Excuse me. We've been working on population coming out our way. We're not that really far from Columbus. We're about a half an hour drive. That's just like going up to Polaris or something like that. But we're part of the Central Ohio landscape. And so what our impact is, or what our knowledge base does, is to research, again, the plants that are best used for whether it's a new development, and even in urban environments, what are the best trees to use in those situations? Because planting 500 million trees isn't going to solve this. It has to be a comprehensive gathering of thought leaders that think of every aspect of what happens as our experience with climate change goes. So with Dawes, our biggest thing is try to get at the table as far as planning goes, land planning, green planning, but also retroactively planning to go into an area. And as was mentioned, you can go on Google Earth, look at the greater Columbus area, and identify the neighborhoods based on the canopy structure. So we have to invest in those things. And it's not a matter of just planting trees. It's a decent plan. Right now, our scientists are going down into southern Ohio River Valley, collecting trees or seeds that have been exposed to warmer temperatures, bringing them up to our area, growing those trees on in hopes that they're going to be more resilient, they're going to be longer lasting, and be much more resistant to any of the decline that we're seeing from those extreme weather changes. So it's working on a number of those layers. We've known that this has been coming for quite some time, and we've been growing trees for that, but now it's a matter of taking our education and taking our knowledge out and making that accessible, like we call it the green belt, going beyond the borders of the Arboretum and having an impact on our communities, and that includes Columbus as well. So much of what we're doing now is how can we help with the greening aspect? And again, that's not the only answer. It has to be part of a comprehensive approach that deals with people where they're at, deals with the experiences that they have, and coming up with a plan that can best do that. But it takes quality trees. It takes knowledge and planning, the right tree in the right spot. And so bringing that type of information to the table, we're always willing and able to participate with a number of organizations.
Luke, when you sit down at the table with a developer and you have some ideas about what they need to bring in to achieve some of these goals, that costs money. What kind of pushback do you get?
There is. Less now in some situations than there was in the past. There seems to be a little bit more receptiveness to green space and to sustainability as far as the landscape goes. That's what we're dealing with. And using Ohio native plants, the best plants that are tolerable for our conditions and so forth. So we spend a lot of time trying to come to the table. Sometimes when a developer is trying to get every square foot into a usable space, that becomes different. Landscaping, trees, greenery, and so forth is usually at the end of the conversation. It's very insignificant for what the use of that particular property is going to be. So it's a matter of education and really working with land planners, really working with architects, really working with landscape architects to really utilize a more holistic approach toward using trees in the landscape and for what purpose. And it combined with a reduction in fossil fuels use. We still have to deal with the CO2 that's in our atmosphere now, and the best way to do that is through plants. So the right plants for the right projects and significant and enough plants need to be included at the table, along with all the other discussions that are taking place.
So you mentioned that there's less pushback now than there has been in years past. Aaron, what do you find in teaching? Are you dealing with a different attitude from a younger generation than from maybe older colleagues?
Yeah, so my experience, I spend a lot of my time through extension actually engaging the agricultural community throughout Ohio. So it typically is still a larger, older, more conservative group. And I can say over the last 5 to 6 years that I've been involved in that work, attitudes have transformed quite a bit, pretty significantly. I can talk about stories of going out and giving presentations and being laughed at during presentations to folks coming back year after year now saying, this is what's happening to me. Again, that personal story. What do I do? How can I build the resilience? What do we possibly do? And at times, you know, when I challenge them and I say, if I told you tomorrow you're going to have 5.5 inches of rain in 2 hours on your field, what are you going to do today? We don't have all the answers to help, you know, build the type of resilience I think we're looking at right now, right? So it's having those engagements, and through those engagements, I've seen a shift, a more acceptance of, certainly, we can get into the terminology and the words used. I think, Alana, you made a great point about sometimes our obstacles is really the language that we're using, right? And so you've seen that in our climate science, from global warming to climate change to extreme weather. And it's because we're trying to get comfortable with those terms, and those terms mean something different to everyone. So if we embrace that the changes are happening, no matter what you call it, you can, you know, call it Clint Eastwood or whatever you want to call it, whatever's happening, Chuck Norris, right? Chuck Norris is greater than climate change. Whatever you want to call it, if we're embracing the fact that it's having a personal impact, I think that changes attitudes.
Janae, does that language make a big difference in the communities that you're seeing?
So I think communities that I'm seeing don't really know the terminology, but they know the effects. Personal example, I grew up about a quarter mile from a landfill in Dayton, Ohio. Those type of effects, having that, being downwind of a landfill, imagine what that's like in the summertime when you're trying to have a party as a kid. You know, in the Columbus area this past summer, you have all the outages and people that lost, you know, refrigerators full of food that they maybe had to use supplemental services to get in the first place. So imagine what that's like for a family. You know, those kind of emotional touch points are what make a big difference in how we shape climate change and how we discuss environmental justice, because people in certain situations, especially populations that we see in and out of our doors at Impact, may not know the terminology. They may not know, you know, what word matches with what, the science behind it. They just know that it affects them personally.
Can I?
So a colleague, Jason Cervenak, and I have been having, you know, good conversations this week even about perceptions in Yale and the Six America studies. If you're not familiar, I think that's something that you would encourage you to check out. And it's a long-term study of people's attitudes, right? But just the perception of you know, a lot more people embrace that changes are happening than we perceive others are actually embracing that change. And so it's some really great research that's taking place that collectively, we all are experiencing it, and we would say that it's happening and having personal impacts more than what, you know, actually more of us are saying that and perceiving that the others feel that way. So it's kind of an interesting point to make here when you think about, you know, knowing or experience or certainly having an awareness of how others are impacted by the changes.
And even just speaking generationally, like my grandmother, she had a creek behind her house, and we would be out there in the summer throwing rocks because she didn't want to lose any of her property line, because she knew how important property was to pass down to family. So erosion control in the summers. You know, I got into environmental science because I had a really awesome science teacher, and I went to a little school in like rural Ohio that had 50 students or less in my graduating class. And we did a summer experiment where we had a mock plane crash outside of our school, where we got out with little pH strips, and I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I had a wonderful lady at a summer camp take an interest in me and get me into her summer program because she saw that I was really passionate about the environment and doing these type of things. So I think even just as my personal experience as an inner city kid, you know, having exposure to things really can adapt and make your life a lot different. And oftentimes those opportunities aren't always available, or people don't know about them. So having more touch points with the community in different spaces where you might not normally go, you might talk to different audiences, you might see different people, you know, come to Impact, we'll have you, we'll welcome you, you know, to have people talk about your programming that, you know, folks that maybe come to our services might not know about, but might make a difference in someone else's life.
Well, let's talk about some of those services real quick, because there's a brand new line in the federal budget at this point for 2023 that includes $18.5 million for more than a dozen community projects right here in Franklin County. So one of those is the Solar Workforce Training Lab. Janae, what's that going to do here in Central Ohio? How does that get us new jobs? How does that get people involved?
So this is my jam. Okay, so we have at Impact, we have an Empowered program, which is in conjunction with Sustainable Columbus and the wonderful folks on their team. And this is a 12-week career exploration program where young adults in opportunity neighborhoods, we're talking Linden, Hilltop, Southside, all these type of communities that historically haven't been represented, folks that look like me, women, young adults, to get that exposure. They get exposure through field trips, through having people come into the classroom to speak, hands-on opportunities to go see the microgrid, solar installation. I mean, they are just getting so much hands-on knowledge that I wish I would have had when I was younger. But this type of career exploration program really makes a difference. Like our graduates from our program, we've had a couple of cohorts thus far, and we're seeing really awesome results where people are getting high-paying jobs to be able to sustain themselves and their families.
So what does that mean for our local economy, Alana? If we have more jobs that we can move toward sustainability, toward renewables, what does that do for our economy? How do we push some of these things forward?
Yeah, so we're betting on that it's going to do great things for our local economy, right? And when we sit and we talk to partners like One Columbus, they talk about how we think we're gonna meet these green jobs goals that we have in our climate action plan, both by growing our existing workforce that Janae talked about with our Empowered program, and really finding these young adults, right, who might not know that the clean energy sector is a growing clean energy sector that has so many opportunities. And also by making sure that the businesses that we're attracting to our region have the same goals that we have as a region, right, and that we have as a city. So being able to say, sustainability is important to us and that we're working to become carbon neutral by 2050, we see that as a selling point, that more and more companies that want to come to the region are going to be interested in coming here because of what we have to offer.
The workforce and the attitude. What do you find, Luke, when you sit down at that table with that conversation for potential employers, for potential manufacturers, for developers who want to come here?
Well, it's an ongoing and long conversation that we have, but a lot of these organizations want to create a space that's conducive to the employees that they're attracting to that space, but also they're trying to be good community neighbors. And they're going into some areas that, in some situations, they're deforesting areas, or they might be eliminating some green space for those things, but then they want to recreate those things, which is difficult because it's harder to do that than it is to maintain existing spaces. But we are seeing that there is this understanding of that. And now it's a little bit more rural where we're at, but we're still active in what's going on in the Columbus area. And again, Licking County and Columbus and Franklin County are really merging. It's the greater metropolitan area. And so, again, it's a matter of really making sure that we're getting our story across, that green space is important to what you're developing here, and that being a good neighbor as far as how it's managed, how it's maintained, the quality of the plants that go in, the quality of the green space that goes in is there as well. We're also working with communities, especially with development, that they have to, at the beginning, design green spaces that are walkable. And you can't just take the worst of the land, create it as a green space, and expect people to get there somehow. And so there needs to be walkable green spaces, and really working with philanthropy to realize that working on developing green spaces that are walkable, that are well-planned, that are using good plants, that we're creating a park or a green space that has the ability to really develop into a mature landscape is important. And not to just look at every green space that we have that's existing, analyze the quality of that, and then evaluate whether or not we should try to maintain that. You brought up a question earlier about the difficulties in trying to budget for some of these things. Well, it's even more difficult, and it's going to be even more costly if we don't do anything. And so we have to look at it as we have to invest in this. The science is there. We have to move forward on a comprehensive, holistic approach that impacts everyone that is impacted by the environment, which is everybody. A case in point, if you look beyond Columbus area, look beyond Ohio or the Ohio River Valley, look on a world scale, 50% of the calories we consume are from 3 types of plants: corn, wheat, and rice. And we know the impact on plants with climate change can be extremely detrimental because of plants are in a stress condition. They're more susceptible to invasive pests that are really revolving around the world at an unbelievable rate now. But if you can just sit there and think if something catastrophic happens weather-wise, what could happen to our food supply? If 50% of the people consume calories from 3 types of plants, corn, wheat, and rice. You really have to stop and think, we need to start doing something now. We need to train people that can deal with this. We need to include botanical and biological sciences in STEM. Photosynthesis, everyone take a deep breath in. That's the original STEM right there. That's science. That's the air we breathe. So we need quality air. We need photosynthesis to take place. That's my jam, I guess. So we need to make sure that that's taking place. But who doesn't love shade? Who doesn't understand the value of green space? Who doesn't understand the value of park systems and so forth? And who doesn't understand the value of not having to inhale diesel fumes, to do land planning so we don't have people living against a landfill, to do a comprehensive approach to this?
Speaking of green space, I would just invite you to look out the window right now at this incredible space that we have right here in the middle of the city, an actual stone's throw from downtown Columbus. Definitely a walkable space. So for the whole panel, let's talk about how we get moving toward the future, because we've already established, and it's potentially being codified, that this is a controversial belief. So how do we move forward with some of these ideas to development and convince folks that this is actually good for the economy as well as for the environment? Aaron?
Yeah, I would say, I think I try to meet people where they are, and what I think, when I think from, I'll draw on the agricultural side of things. A lot of things that farmers are doing are already climate smart. Climate's making them that much more important that we continue to do that. It's about water management, land management, resources, and energy management. And all of that is a place where we can, and I think, Alana, you mentioned it, when you think about the energy savings, that's a place not a lot of people don't want to participate in saving money, right? And so that is certainly, I think, one avenue that we look toward to get more participation. I think, again, you have to make sure, you have to demonstrate that both the impacts are happening to them and that also the benefits, and there are opportunities that if we are good managers of our resources, then we can create better outcomes for the future. And so I like to start there with action.
We're going to take some audience questions in just a couple of minutes. So if you have questions and you'd like to ask those, you can step to the back. We have a microphone there ready for your questions. If you're watching online, you can type those into the chat, and we'll be curating those as well. So before we get to those questions, can I still plant my tomatoes in the middle of May?
Sure.
Yeah, not quite. It's soil temperature. You might want to wait a little bit because it's, the whole thing, it's Ohio.
And am I going to have to change the whole forsythia thing and 3 snows after that because North Carolina is moving here? Is that what's happening?
When you think about climate change, it's not all about, hey, we can grow really decent peaches here now and crepe myrtles and so forth. It's what we're going to lose. There's some decent plants. Yeah, Buckeyes. Decent plants we're losing. We're already, in my career, have seen this unbelievable decline in sugar maple trees, which is a standard backbone tree for hardwood forests in Ohio. We're already seeing it on decline. And one of the things that it just cannot stand, it loves cold temperatures, and it can take hot temperatures. It can't take that freeze-thaw. What did you say the temperature drop was in December? From 40 degrees down to 8 degrees or something like that. But it can tolerate the 8 below, but it can't tolerate 40 one day, 8 below the next day, 40 the next day. That's the impact. It's still looking at the entire ecosystem of a small change in average temperature throws the whole system off. It's the soil microorganisms. It's the understory of a forest. It's the pollinators. It's the wildlife around them. All of these things throw these systems off and changes these systems that are crucial. All life depends on natural systems, and we have to make sure that that's part of it as well. And now we need to do is to take the steps to improve, and we have to take steps to adapt to some of the changes that are already taking place, but we have to slow things down. We have to take action to slow things down. And there are varieties of ways to do that.
We have a small line developing in the back of the room. I'm sure we have questions online as well. Quick note, just as a matter of respect for others, keep your question brief. We would prefer that you don't pontificate. Please have a question that does end in a question mark and bring it on. Mantra, who do we have first?
All right, this is our first online question. Kathy Becker from Buckeye Environmental Network asks, Ohio has passed a state law and appears full speed ahead on fracking our state parks. How is this compatible with addressing the climate crisis?
Alana, how would the city deal with that if it were happening in this metro park?
It's a great question, and a hard one, and Kathy, thank you for always asking the hard questions. So I think, what we would say, right, is that we are trying to move towards a clean energy transition, right? And a clean energy transition means energy from renewable sources, and that's what we want, right? It's what's sustainable, it's what's gonna ensure that we don't see those greenhouse gas emission increases. We need to see greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Hello, I'm with Columbus Community Radio Station WGRN, the Green Renaissance. My interest is monitoring overnight temperatures, and you can go to weather.gov and see daily records set for high temperature and maximum low temperatures, which would be overnight temperatures. Turns out for the month of May, for example, we have 2 days that have, since year 2000, set daily high record temperatures, but we have 11 days since the year 2000 with record overnight temperatures. I consider this climate change sneaking up on us as we're sleeping. So my question, perhaps Luke, you could comment on what do these overnight higher temperatures do for the plant world? How are crops affected? How are other plants affected?
Well, one of the things to keep in consideration that plants are living things. They're the largest living things if you look at some of the gigantic trees that we have. So you begin to look at these nighttime temperatures. Trees do go through a period of, I guess, to make things simple, rest. And so as nighttime temperatures are taking place, it has more of an impact on the associated insects and wildlife that are around those plants, because a lot of our pollinators depend on these plants as food sources. So we want to be able to look at it from the standpoint of what is it going to do with warmer temperatures in the evening as far as the health of the plant. It's more the weather extremes and the total temperature. And if we're not getting that cooling, that's contributing to a higher average temperature that's taking place if you look at the entire 24-hour period. So I think that is a Ph.D. in the process, is to look at that. So I have not considered it entirely, but I do know cooler temperatures aligned with longer days and warmer daytime temperatures have an impact on plant health.
And I was just going to say, it doesn't only affect plants, it affects people. I personally have fibromyalgia. This up and down swing of weather between day and night, jumping from 30 degrees to 70 degrees, back and forth, it kills you. And then on top of that, when we think about all the different types of pollutants in the atmosphere, people that have high cases of asthma experience more events. Our hospitals get busier, which means people incur more costs. I mean, this is a snowball effect that all happens and precipitates from climate change. So it's not just plants alone. It has direct impact on people and their lives and their livelihood, not being able to go to work and things like that.
Warmer nights mean you may not sleep quite as well, and that can affect your health as well. What about growing degree days and heating degree days, and how this is affecting how those plants grow, Aaron?
Yeah, so certainly we've seen pretty strong trends across Ohio in terms of growing degree day accumulation. A lot more actually in the fall, so we're having later fall freezes. We are also having earlier last freezes in the spring, but just not quite to the magnitude of the fall lateness. Anyway, the way it affects, thinking about crops, I'm thinking about things like wheat and wheat development. It affects how gluten is developed, right? And so the nutritional value of some of those foods that we depend on, like corn and wheat, are certainly impacted by these warmer overnight lows and the accumulation of growing degree days. We see those shifts in the growing degree days and the shifts in our growing zones and plant zones. But it doesn't mean we're not going to have a winter or 2 or 3 where those newer plants, right? We've shifted into mostly 6, right? Growing zone 6, we think projections were into growing zone 7. But how many years out of 10 will that sustain plants that we typically think of growing zone 7? So those are, it's the differences, again, between averages and then the weather actually impacts that can make a difference. So, again, difference between looking at the average changes and those particular weather events.
All right. Next question is, what will be the impact on Ohio agriculture? What crops will decline? Which might be better in a warmer Ohio?
Basket moving to Canada?
Yeah, so I'll answer that. I think, so crop modeling, look, modeling is difficult, right? It's not perfect. Our climate models are not perfect, and guess what? All the models that depend on climate models are not imperfect, aren't perfect either. When we think about the latest kind of guidance on crops in the future, we see a global decline of corn by about 6 to 24% by the end of the 21st century. Funny enough, we see an increase in some of those projections of a benefit of 8% more wheat grown across the globe, right? And so thinking again about those transitions of what type of food. We do have technology, we have hybrids, we have genetics. These are all things that are going to help us build the resilience, right? So I'm not going to say we're not growing corn or soy or other crops here in Ohio, but I often challenge it again. We're going to have an Arkansas climate in 2100, right? So what will we be growing in Ohio? Is it rice? Is thinking about those different crops is really important, but it's not that simple. It's really complex. It's going to depend a lot on what we do in terms of making decisions here. And you can see, you can find the research that thinks about, under carbon neutrality in the future, what do the food regions of the world and even the United States look like? And some of those experiments would say that it really shifts and concentrates in parts of Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas here in the United States. So there's a lot of research out there. Try to distill it down for you real quick, but there will be impacts, obviously.
Let me ask you the unfair question.
Sure.
And can we put that in perspective in that if we lose 24% of our production of corn, what does that mean for the amount that we ship overseas and how that affects our economy and how that impacts the rest of the globe?
Yeah, and that's a global number. So the 24, it's 6 to 24% decline. Again, that's a big range, right? Because of the uncertainty. Certainly it's going to change. And again, it's going to affect, I would imagine it's going to affect the United States a little bit, probably less of an impact than many other parts of the globe, right? Where food security is a much more dire situation than we are. And so, obviously it will have and will be impacted by those global supply and demand chains throughout the entire region and world.
Mantra?
We consider scientists and policymakers and planners the experts in this context, but what does it look like to recognize community members with their lived experiences as the experts to inform effective climate adaptation in Columbus?
So I'm going to start, and then I was talking to Janae that she'll go next. So I think that that's really critical, right? Recognizing people and what their experiences are and collecting those experiences. One thing that the Impact team and the Sustainable Columbus team have been talking about is that we need to build out climate stories, right? We need to be able to have those to talk about. And so that's a project that we're working on. But the other thing that you may have sparked, but I want to make sure that I get in here, is that we have over 23,000 Columbus residents, Central Ohio residents, who have committed to taking action on climate. And those people are Green Spot members. And that's a great avenue if you're looking for, what do I do today? This all seems really scary and really dire. It's not. The IPCC report tells us it's not. It tells us that we have all the technology we need to be able to address this big problem, and that we just need to accelerate and take more action. But if you are looking for what do I do today after I leave, become a Green Spot member. Commit to taking some small actions in your life that are going to make a difference. But then you'll also join a community of folks that are also interested in being climate ambassadors. So I don't know if that is exactly your question, but I definitely wanted to hit the green spot.
Does that lived experience make someone inherently an expert?
I think everyone is an expert on their lived experience. So, for instance, at Impact, we have a team of community advocates who I am humbled and graciously enough able to lead. And these are folks that live in our opportunity neighborhoods who talk with their neighbors about environmental issues. So it's a lot easier to have the cultural and respect for someone to talk neighbor to neighbor versus, me from Dayton coming to a neighborhood and having a conversation about environmental issues. We are able to have good partnerships with folks like Franklin County Soil and Water District to help with their community backyards program, where in historically disinvested areas, we're now able to offer people free rain barrels, rain garden vouchers, compost bins. It's all about forming partnerships and using the people at your disposal in the appropriate ways to network into community and neighborhoods.
Montre, how about an online question?
Yes. So this question is from Kathy Ann Kowalski from Energy News Network and Eye on Ohio. What steps should Ohio lawmakers and regulators be taking to improve resilience to climate change impacts that they're not already taking or doing effectively?
I'll chime in. I think there should be more community involvement around what that looks like for each community, because my community may look different than yours may look different than hers. So having that community buy-in and input, I think, is going to be drastically important. And when we talk about resiliency, because if people are, not aware that it exists or how to use a resilience hub, for instance, appropriately, it won't matter in the event of an emergency or some type of event. So having that community buy-in and input from the very beginning, I think, is a policy change that could occur.
Alana?
Yeah, there's a whole panoply of things that we could talk about here, but one of the things that I do want to say is there's some exciting movement on the state level. Our Ohio EPA has raised their hand, and they've said that they're going to take federal dollars to develop a state-wide climate action plan. And that's huge, right? It really is. And no matter how you message it or how you talk about it, right, which is something that they're going to have to work through, and we're going to talk about, I know, is that's going to create real opportunity for us in the climate space. And so there's some really positive places. Investing in energy efficiency is one that's really important to us. It's really important to our work with Janae. The federal government has done that, but when there are opportunities at the state level to invest in energy efficiency, I think that's really critical and really important. And I think Aaron is leaning in, so he's got something to say.
Well, I as a scientist, typically, we remain based in the scientific evidence, right? I would just say trust the experts and trust the science and lean into that science to let us help you in developing the resilience, right? Through the science that we are kind of sharing, so.
Alana, if the Ohio EPA is leaning into this, there would seem to be a schism then between the EPA and the folks who actually pass the budget. So how do we bridge that gap?
So, Marshall, I don't want to pretend to be an expert in all of the state politics and the workings between agencies and the General Assembly and how that works. But, it's about investing in opportunity, and I think that's the way, I don't want to speak for an agency that I don't work for, but I think that's the way that a lot of us look at this is, by doing the planning, you're investing in opportunity. You're investing in the opportunity to get additional federal dollars that are going to help with infrastructure and infrastructure planning. But I definitely don't want to speak to a schism between state organizations that I might not know enough about.
One last question.
My name is Brian Urbanski with the Aubrey Affordable Housing Foundation, and we work exclusively with low-income residents, and particularly the justice-involved community. And Janae, I know this is your jam. I want to thank you for all the help you've already given our residents, you and Bo and your whole team. It's been phenomenally helpful to them. And what I'd like to know is, as an organization, and I know many other housing providers, what can we do to get this information out to our residents so they could take advantage of your climate programs?
Short answer, come see me and we'll exchange information. Yeah, but no, seriously, share, network. It's all about getting the information out to the people that need it the most. So yes, I would be more than happy to talk with you afterwards about that.
Great questions. Thank you so much for having us today. Kristen Easterday has a few concluding remarks, but thank you so much today.
I hope that everyone enjoyed today's forum as much as I did. It was extremely insightful, and one of the things that I especially learned beyond all the science here was that we all have a personal climate story, and that can be our path to be part of the solution and how we move forward. So thank you to Grange Insurance Audubon Center, our virtual seat patrons, and the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's live stream. And of course, thank you to our awesome speakers, Janae Graham, Luke Messinger, Alana Shockey, Aaron Wilson, and Marshall McPeek. Thank you so much. So please make plans now to attend next Wednesday's forum, as we will welcome David Chitsvitska from the United Nations right here at the Grange Audubon Center. So please take a moment to also answer the short survey that is in your forum flyers. And thank you to everyone. We could not do this without you. Have a great weekend.